Howdy, partners, and welcome to tonight's tale from the untamed frontiers of the American West. As the evening sun sets over distant mountains, we invite you to lay down your weary head and drift into the mysterious world of Red Dead Redemption. Each night, we'll share different tales from these wild lands, where outlaws and legends still roam free. And when our story ends, the gentle sounds of the frontier, crackling campfires, distant coyotes, rustling prairie grass, and the soft whisper of the wind will carry you into peaceful dreams beneath the star-filled western sky, with no advertisements to disturb your slumber. Now, saddle up, partner, and let's mosey on down to tonight's tale. Evening shadows stretched long across the weathered planks of Bayou Noir's small dock as Thomas Holloway settled into his creaking rocking chair. At 72, the former riverboat captain had found an unexpected peace in the role of night watchman for this sleepy river town. His weathered hands, once firm on the wheel of the mighty steamers that had plied these waters, now rested gently on the arms of his chair, fingers tracing patterns worn into the wood by years of identical movement. The wrinkles etched deeply around his eyes spoke of countless days squinting against harsh sun and driving rain, while a certain softness around his mouth hinted at a man who had seen enough of life to find humor in its contradictions. A lone oil lamp cast a gentle glow that barely reached the edge of the dock, beyond which the Lanahichi River flowed broad and unhurried, its surface transformed by moonlight into a shifting tapestry of silver and shadow. Tonight marked the third full moon of summer, heavy and yellow as it rose above the distant tree line, casting enough light that Thomas could have extinguished his lamp entirely and still seen clear to the opposite shore. But he kept it burning nonetheless, a habit formed through decades on the river, a small beacon against uncertainty. Thomas removed his worn flat cap and set it on his knee, running fingers through hair that had long since turned from chestnut to silver. The night air carried the sweet scent of magnolias mingled with the river's perpetual musk of mud and growth and slow decay, the perfume of these lowlands that had been the backdrop to most of his life. Somewhere in the distance, a whippoorwill called, its melancholy notes hanging in the still air before fading into the chorus of crickets and frogs that formed the nighttime symphony of the bayou. "Grandpa, I brought your evening coffee," the voice cut brightly through Thomas's contemplation as Emma, his 17-year-old granddaughter, approached along the wooden walkway. She carried a steaming tin mug in one hand, her other holding up the hem of her skirt to keep it from dragging on the rough-hewn boards. In the lamplight, her features, so reminiscent of his late daughter's, seemed to hover between childhood and womanhood, caught in that fleeting moment of transition that always made Thomas's heart ache with a peculiar mixture of pride and melancholy. "You're too good to your old grandpa," he said, accepting the coffee with a nod of thanks. "Shouldn't you be helping your mama with the little ones?" Emma settled onto the small bench beside his chair, smoothing her skirt with practiced grace. "They're all asleep, even Mama's turned in early with her headache." She glanced out over the water. "It's prettier out here anyway, especially with the moon so bright." Thomas sipped his coffee, strong and sweetened with just a touch of molasses, exactly as he preferred it, and nodded. "Full moon always makes the river look like it's made of hammered silver. Used to navigate by nothing but moonlight sometimes, when the boiler needed nursing and we couldn't spare the coal for running lights." Emma smiled, having heard variations of this story many times before, but never tiring of her grandfather's tales. "Tell me again about the Belle of Saint Denis," she prompted, drawing her knees up to her chest and wrapping her arms around them in the comfortable posture of a child settling in for a favorite bedtime story. "Ah, the Belle," Thomas sighed, his eyes taking on the distant look that always preceded his most vivid recollections. Finest paddle wheeler ever to grace these waters. 3 decks high, with gingerbread trim, white as fresh cream and scrollwork that'd make a cathedral envy. Her paddle wheel stood taller than 2 men, and when she was running at full steam, you could feel her heart beat through the soles of your boots, no matter where you stood on board. As Thomas spoke, his right hand unconsciously rose to touch the small brass pin affixed to his lapel. A miniature paddle wheel, tarnished by years but still recognizable as the insignia of the Belle of Saint-Denis. It was his most treasured possession, a reminder of the 15 years he had served as her pilot, before age and changing times had conspired to end that chapter of his life. She could carry 200 passengers in high style, with velvet upholstery in the grand salon and crystal chandeliers that scattered light like diamonds when they swayed with the river's motion. Her kitchens turned out 5-course dinners that'd make a New Orleans chef weep with envy, and the gaming salon saw fortunes won and lost between Saint-Denis and Van Horn. And the musicians, Emma prompted, knowing this part of the story well, but cherishing it nonetheless. Thomas's face softened further. Finest ensemble on the river, a quartet that could play anything from Bach to barrelhouse blues. Piano, violin, clarinet, and upright bass, though sometimes Clarence, he was the clarinet man, would switch to harmonica for the mellower evening sets. They played on the upper deck during fine evenings, and in the grand salon when weather threatened. Many a night I'd guide her through soft darkness with that music floating up to the wheelhouse, keeping me company through the midnight hours. He paused, sipping his coffee and gazing out over the water as if half expecting to see the Belle materialize from the moon-silvered mist that had begun to gather along the river's surface. Been gone 30 years now. Boiler explosion took her near Rhodes in '69. Terrible business. Lost 17 souls that day, including 3 of the 4 musicians. His voice dropped nearly to a whisper. Only Elijah, the violin player, made it out alive, and he never played another note after that day, far as anybody knows. Emma reached out to touch her grandfather's arm, having heard about the tragedy but still moved by the sorrow that crept into his voice whenever he spoke of it. "I'm sorry, Grandpa." Thomas patted her hand, his weathered palm rough against her smooth skin. "Old history now, darling. Rivers full of such stories. Takes some things, gives others. That's the way of water." He straightened slightly in his chair, as if physically setting aside melancholy memories. "Besides, some folks around here say the Belle still makes her rounds, in a manner of speaking." Emma tilted her head, curiosity brightening her expression. "What do you mean?" "Well," Thomas began, his voice taking on the measured cadence he used for tales that walked the line between history and legend. "There's talk of a riverboat that appears on nights when the moon is as full as it is tonight. No steam from her stacks, no churning of her wheel, just a silent vessel drifting downstream, like she's riding the current without effort. They say she glows with a light that's not quite lamplight, softer, like moonlight captured in glass, and from her decks comes music so faint you might think you're imagining it, until it catches in your mind and stays there for days afterward." Emma gave a small, skeptical smile. "A ghost ship? Really, Grandpa?" Though her tone was teasing, there was genuine affection beneath it. "Next you'll be telling me about the swamp witch who turns men into bullfrogs." Thomas chuckled, not offended by her disbelief. "I'm just telling you what folks say, Emma. I haven't laid eyes on her myself, but Jerome Fisher, runs the mercantile over on Cypress Street, swears he saw her 2 summers back while night fishing below the Big Bend. Said she passed right by him, silent as owl's wings, with blue-white light spilling from her windows, and the sound of a fiddle playing so sweet it brought tears to his eyes. Mr. Fisher also claims he once caught a catfish big enough to pull his boat halfway to Saint Denis, Emma countered with the gentle impertinence of youth. That he does, Thomas conceded with another chuckle. He does. But he's not the only one with such a tale. Leland Cole, who's got no reputation for fancy storytelling, came into the Shady Bell saloon, white as a sheet, one night last spring, claiming he'd seen the phantom riverboat while riding home along the shore road. Said he recognized the tune floating across the water, an old river song his grandmother used to sing, something about following the water to find your heart's true home. Emma's expression softened slightly, her skepticism tempered by the evident sincerity in her grandfather's voice. And you believe them? That there's really a ghost ship sailing the Lanahichi? Thomas took another sip of his coffee, considering his answer. I believe they saw something that defied easy explanation. As for ghosts, well, I've spent most of my life on this river, and I've seen things that made me question what I know about the boundaries between this world and whatever lies beyond it. The river keeps its own counsel and reveals its secrets in its own time. He set his empty mug on the small table beside his chair. Besides, who's to say what echoes remain when something as alive as the bell meets a violent end? All that music, all those dreams and schemes hatched over card tables, all those lives intertwined with her journeys. Perhaps something of that essence lingers, unwilling or unable to fade entirely from this world. Emma was quiet for a moment, her gaze drawn to the mist that had continued to gather over the water, transforming the river into something dreamlike and mysterious. If it is real, she finally said, I wonder why a ghost ship would keep sailing. What would it be looking for? It was a thoughtful question, and Thomas nodded appreciatively. Some say it's searching for safe harbor, a journey never completed in life, continuing in whatever comes after. Others think it's trying to warn travelers of dangers on the river, appearing near where accidents have happened or might happen. But old Josiah Wade, you remember him, used to play fiddle at the town dances before his hands got too knotted with arthritis. He has a different idea. What's that? Emma asked, drawn into the story despite her earlier skepticism. Josiah says the phantom riverboat appears to those who stand at crossroads in their lives. Not to everyone, only to those with music in their souls, as he puts it. Says the boat and its ghostly musicians remind folks that life, like the river, keeps flowing forward, and sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is surrender to that current and see where it takes them. Thomas fell silent, his gaze once again drawn to the river where mist now curled in elegant patterns above the water's surface, occasionally parting to reveal moon-silvered wavelets that seemed to wink like knowing eyes before disappearing again beneath the vaporous veil. It's getting late, Emma said after a comfortable silence had stretched between them. Mama will worry if I'm not back soon. She stood, brushing non-existent wrinkles from her skirt before leaning down to plant a kiss on her grandfather's weathered cheek. Don't stay up all night watching for ghost ships, she added with a teasing smile. Thomas returned her smile, reaching up to pat her hand. I'll be along shortly, just want to finish my watch in proper fashion. He gestured toward the mist-shrouded river. Beautiful night for stargazing, even if the only vessels passing are made of fog and moonlight. After Emma had departed, her light footsteps fading along the wooden walkway, Thomas settled deeper into his chair. The night had grown profoundly quiet, with even the chorus of frogs and insects seeming to hold their collective breath. The mist continued to thicken over the water until the far shore had disappeared entirely, leaving only a silvery void beyond the edge of the dock. Thomas felt a peculiar stillness settle over him, not the stillness of tension or anticipation, but rather a deep quietude that seemed to extend from his body into the surrounding night. And then, so faintly he might have imagined it, came the sound of music drifting across the water, a single harmonica playing a melody both familiar and elusive, like a half-remembered dream. The notes rose and fell with gentle precision, neither happy nor sad, but containing elements of both. A tune that spoke of journeys and returns, of loss and discovery, of the circular nature of human experience. Thomas straightened in his chair, straining his eyes to penetrate the mist that now completely obscured the river. The music grew slightly louder, still distant, but undeniably present. A melancholy harmonica joined now by the softer strains of a violin, the two instruments weaving around each other in perfect harmony. A melody that tugged at his memory, hovering just beyond the edge of recognition, and then he saw it, or thought he did. A faint glow within the mist, diffuse at first, but gradually resolving into the suggestion of a vessel moving slowly downstream. Not clearly visible, more an impression than a concrete image, but Thomas would have staked his life on what it was, a riverboat, 3 decks high, its shape graceful and proud against the luminous fog. His heart began to beat faster, though not with fear. Instead, he felt a profound sense of recognition, coupled with a bittersweet longing that brought tears to his eyes. The music continued, joined now by what sounded like a piano and the deep, resonant notes of an upright bass. A full quartet, playing with flawless coordination, their melody carrying effortlessly across the water. As the ethereal vessel drew nearer, floating parallel to the shore, perhaps 100 yards out, Thomas rose from his chair on legs that felt surprisingly steady. He moved to the edge of the dock, drawn by an impulse he couldn't have explained, but felt no need to question. The music washed over him in gentle waves, and within its complex patterns he began to discern a familiar refrain. Shenandoah, one of the oldest and most beloved river songs, but played with embellishments he had never heard before, transforming the simple melody into something transcendent. The glowing outline of the riverboat was clearer now, though still veiled by mist and moonlight, its edges softly blurred, as if existing simultaneously in multiple realities. Thomas could make out the silhouette of its tall stacks, the elegant curve of its upper decks, and the massive paddle wheel at its stern. Motionless, yet somehow conveying the impression of rotation through some trick of light and shadow. From the middle deck, where the grand salon would be located, spilled a gentle blue-white radiance unlike any lamplight Thomas had ever seen. Neither harsh nor flickering, but steady as starlight, and just as remote. Within that glow moved shadowy figures, suggesting passengers engaged in the timeless activities of riverboat leisure, conversing, perhaps dancing, gathering around gaming tables, or simply gazing out at the passing shore. But it was to the upper deck that Thomas's attention was inexorably drawn. There, partially visible through the mist, 4 figures stood arranged in the classic formation of a riverboat quartet. Though distance and atmospheric conditions prevented him from distinguishing their features clearly, their postures were unmistakable. One seated at what could only be a piano, another holding a violin to his shoulder, a third cradling what appeared to be a clarinet, or perhaps the harmonica, currently leading the melody, and the fourth standing beside an upright bass. The music swelled slightly as the boat drew level with the dock, the haunting refrain of Shenandoah giving way to another tune that sent a shock of recognition through Thomas. The Belle's Waltz, a piece composed specifically for the Belle of Saint Denis by her original pianist and played only aboard that vessel. Thomas had not heard it in over 30 years, not since the day of the explosion, that had claimed both the boat and most of her musicians. Without conscious decision, Thomas raised his right hand in the traditional river pilot's salute, a gesture of respect and recognition exchanged between passing vessels. For a moment, that seemed to extend beyond normal boundaries of time. He stood thus, hand raised, eyes fixed on the ghostly riverboat as it drifted silently past his position. And then, though he would question later whether it had truly happened or been a product of moonlight and mist playing tricks on aging eyes, he saw one of the figures on the upper deck detach from the others and move to the railing, a slender arm raised, in mirror of his own salute, holding what might have been a violin bow, tilted in acknowledgement before returning to position. The music never faltered, continuing its ethereal performance as the riverboat began to disappear into the mist downstream, its glow gradually diminishing until only the faintest suggestion of light remained, and finally even that was gone. The music lingered longer than the visual apparition, floating back across the water with diminishing clarity, until Thomas could no longer distinguish between actual sound and the echo of melody in his memory. Eventually that too faded, leaving him alone on the dock with only the returning chorus of frogs and night insects for company. Thomas remained at the edge of the dock for some time afterward, his thoughts drifting like the mist over the water. He felt neither frightened nor bewildered by what he had witnessed, or believed he had witnessed. Instead, a profound sense of peace had settled over him, as if some long, unresolved tension had finally found release. When he finally turned back toward his chair to retrieve his cap, Thomas noticed that his hands, so often plagued by the tremors of advancing age, were perfectly steady. He flexed his fingers experimentally, marveling at how limber they felt, how free of the arthritic stiffness that usually troubled him on damp evenings. A small miracle, perhaps, or simply the temporary remission that sometimes occurs in chronic conditions. Either way, he accepted it with the same equanimity with which he had accepted the vision on the river. Gathering his few belongings, Thomas extinguished the oil lamp and made his way along the dock toward shore, his steps sure despite the darkness. The full moon provided ample light for his journey, transforming the familiar path into something slightly magical. An ordinary route made extraordinary by altered perception. Much like life itself, Thomas reflected as he walked. The same events, viewed through different eyes or at different times, could appear wholly transformed without changing their essential nature. By the time he reached his small cabin at the edge of town, nestled beneath ancient live oaks draped with Spanish moss, the experience had already begun to take on the quality of a particularly vivid dream. Yet the melody of the bell's waltz remained clear in his mind, and he found himself humming it softly as he prepared for bed, the notes rising and falling with the precision of recent hearing rather than distant memory. Morning arrived with the golden clarity characteristic of early autumn days in the bayou country. Thomas awoke feeling more rested than he had in years, the heaviness that often accompanied his first waking moments noticeably absent. After a simple breakfast, he found himself drawn inexorably back to the river, arriving at the dock just as the morning mist was burning away under the strengthening sun. In daylight, the Lanahichi presented a very different aspect, busy with the practical commerce of a working waterway rather than the mysterious beauty of its nocturnal incarnation. A small fishing boat chugged upstream, its pilot raising a hand in casual salute as he passed. On the far shore, herons waded in the shallows, their graceful forms reflected in water turned from silver to amber by morning light. Thomas stood at the same spot where he had witnessed, or imagined, the phantom riverboat the night before. By day, no trace remained of the ethereal vessel or its spectral music, yet he felt no doubt about what he had experienced. Some things existed beyond the realm of rational explanation or physical evidence, residing instead in that liminal space where perception and reality blended into personal truth. "Thought I might find you here," came a familiar voice from behind him. Thomas turned to find Josiah Wade making his careful way along the dock, leaning heavily on a carved hickory cane. At 78, the former fiddler moved with the deliberate caution of a man well acquainted with the increased fragility of aging bones, yet his eyes remained bright beneath bushy white brows, missing little of what crossed their path. "Morning, Josiah," Thomas greeted him. "You're out and about early today?" Josiah nodded, coming to stand beside Thomas at the dock's edge. "Sleep doesn't court me the way it used to. Dawn and I have become well acquainted these past few years." He gestured toward the river with his free hand. "Besides, something told me you might have had an interesting night watch." Thomas glanced sharply at his old friend, trying to determine if there was specific knowledge behind the comment, or merely Josiah's usual intuition. The former musician's expression revealed nothing beyond mild curiosity and the habitual slight smile that had earned him the nickname Smiling Wade in his younger years. "What makes you say that?" Thomas asked, neither confirming nor denying. Josiah's smile deepened slightly. "Full moon last night. River mist thick as cream. Perfect conditions for unusual observations." The careful phrasing caused Thomas to chuckle despite himself. "You mean perfect conditions for seeing ghost ships?" "Did you?" Josiah asked simply, his gaze steady on Thomas's face. Thomas considered deflecting the question with humor or changing the subject entirely, but something in Josiah's expression, an openness, a lack of judgment, invited honesty. "I saw something," he admitted quietly. "Heard something too. Music like I haven't heard in 30 years. The Bell's Waltz played exactly as Maxwell Coleman composed it for the Belle of Saint Denis." Josiah nodded slowly, unsurprised. "I thought you might have. There's a look people get after such encounters. A kind of peaceful bewilderment, if that makes any sense. Like they've been given a gift they don't fully understand but know is valuable nonetheless." "You've seen it too, then?" Thomas asked, though he already knew the answer. "3 times over the years," Josiah confirmed. "First time was the night after I buried Martha. I'd walked down to the river because the house was too empty, too quiet without her. Sat right where your rocking chair stands now and cried until I had no tears left. That's when I heard it. Fiddle music, floating across the water, playing Martha's favorite hymn." He paused, visibly moved by the memory, despite the decades that had passed since his wife's death, looked up and saw the riverboat coming through the mist, all glowing like moonlight turned solid. Couldn't make out much detail at that distance, but I'd stake my life that the fiddler playing on the upper deck was Elijah Jackson. Same tall, lean build, same way of holding the instrument high on the shoulder. "Elijah," Thomas repeated softly. "The only musician who survived the Bell's explosion." "The very same," Josiah agreed, "though he never played another note in this life, far as anybody knows. Put away his fiddle after the accident and never took it up again, despite having hands still perfectly capable. Said the music had gone out of him. Lived another 12 years, but never touched an instrument again. At least, not that anyone witnessed." Thomas absorbed this information thoughtfully. "You said you saw the riverboat 3 times. When were the others?" "Second time was just after I had to give up playing due to these gnarled hands," Josiah replied, flexing his fingers to demonstrate the twisted joints that had ended his musical career. "I was in a dark place then, feeling like I'd lost my purpose along with my ability to make music. Took to sitting by the river at night, nursing a bottle of whiskey and a healthy portion of self-pity. He shook his head, smiling ruefully at the memory of his younger self. Full moon, of course. I heard music coming across the water. Not just any music, but a piece I'd composed myself years earlier, and played only a handful of times at local dances. Never wrote it down, never taught it to another living soul, yet there it was, perfect in every detail, floating from the deck of that ghostly riverboat. "Did you see who was playing it?" Thomas asked, fascinated despite his usual practical nature. Couldn't swear to individual faces, but I'd bet considerable money that one of the figures standing on that upper deck was Maxwell Coleman himself, the Bell's pianist who died in the explosion. He and I used to swap tunes whenever the Bell docked here. Must have remembered my composition all those years. Thomas nodded slowly, finding the idea strangely comforting rather than disturbing. And the third time, a more complex emotion crossed Josiah's weathered features. Something like wonder mingled with profound acceptance. That was 5 years back, just after the doctor told me the pains in my chest weren't just indigestion, but a heart that's wearing out. I came down to the river that night trying to make peace with the idea of limited time. He gestured toward the water flowing steadily past them. The riverboat appeared, same as before, but this time it came closer to shore than I'd ever seen it. Close enough that I could make out faces on the upper deck. Not clearly, mind you, more like looking at someone through rippled glass, but clear enough. "Who did you see?" Thomas asked softly, sensing they had reached the heart of Josiah's story. Maxwell at the piano, Clarence with his clarinet, Bartholomew on bass, all of the Bell's original musicians who perished in the explosion. And Elijah too, playing his fiddle, with an expression of such joy it nearly broke my heart to witness it. Josiah's voice had dropped nearly to a whisper. They were all there, Thomas. Not as they were at the end, broken or burned or drowned, but whole and vibrant, making music together as if they'd never stopped. Thomas felt a shiver pass through him that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with recognition of profound truth. "What did you do?" "I raised my hand in greeting," Josiah said simply, and Elijah, or whoever or whatever wore his semblance, nodded to me and smiled. Then he did something I'll never forget as long as I draw breath. He pointed his bow directly at me and then gestured downstream, as if to say, "We'll see you further along the river." The two men stood in companionable silence after that, watching the morning traffic on the Lanahichi, while contemplating matters that transcended ordinary daily concern. Birds called from the nearby cypresses, their voices occasionally rising above the gentle lapping of water against the dock pilings. From town came the distant sounds of commerce beginning. Wagon wheels on packed dirt, a blacksmith's hammer striking rhythmically against an anvil, human voices calling greetings or haggling over prices. "You know what I think?" Josiah finally said, breaking their contemplative quiet. "I think that riverboat isn't searching for anything. It's not lost or trapped or trying to complete some unfinished journey. What is it doing then?" Thomas asked. Josiah smiled, the expression transforming his lined face into a map of hard-earned wisdom. "Continuing. Simply continuing what brought joy in life. Making music, traveling the river, connecting with those still on this shore, not as punishment or unfinished business, but as extension, continuation of what mattered most." Thomas considered this perspective, finding it aligned with his own impressions from the previous night. There had been nothing mournful or desperate about the phantom riverboat or its spectral musicians. No sense of souls in torment or spirits unable to find rest. Instead, the entire apparition had conveyed a quality of serene purpose, of harmony both musical and existential. Do you think you'll see it again? He asked Josiah. The old fiddler shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling with the easy acceptance of a man who had made peace with life's uncertainties. Perhaps. Or perhaps my next encounter with those musicians will be from the other side of the veil. Either way, I find comfort in knowing they're out there, still playing, still traveling the river that defined their lives. He patted Thomas's shoulder with gnarled but gentle fingers. And now you've seen it too. Means you're at a crossing point, according to the tales. A crossing point? Thomas repeated thoughtfully. I suppose that's accurate enough. Been feeling lately like I'm just marking time, no real purpose, beyond watching a dock where less and less traffic passes each year. Emma will be marrying soon, moving up to Ansburg with that mining engineer she's sweet on. Her mother will likely follow, wanting to be near the grandchildren when they come. And you've been wondering what comes next, Josiah finished for him, whether to go with them or stay here, where the river flows familiar, but increasingly lonely. Thomas nodded, somewhat surprised by his friend's perceptiveness. Something like that. Well, Josiah said, straightening with a slight wince as his back protested the movement, if last night's visitation follows the pattern of my own experiences, you'll find yourself seeing things clearer in the coming days. Not that decisions get easier, necessarily, but the right path tends to reveal itself once you stop trying to force an answer. He turned to make his way back along the dock, moving with the careful deliberation of advanced age. I'm heading to the mercantile for some tobacco. Care to join me? Thomas shook his head. Think I'll stay here a while longer, but I appreciate the company, Josiah. And the perspective. After the old fiddler had departed, Thomas remained at the edge of the dock, watching the river's steady flow with renewed attention. Each ripple, each eddy, each subtle variation in current spoke of the water's endless journey, always moving yet somehow remaining the same river that had carved this course over countless centuries. There was wisdom in that paradox, Thomas reflected. Perhaps the truest continuity existed not in static permanence, but in graceful adaptation to the inevitability of change. The day passed in quiet contemplation, interspersed with the practical tasks of his watchman's role, assisting the occasional boat that docked, maintaining the simple facilities, keeping basic records of river traffic. Yet beneath these routine activities ran a current of heightened awareness, a sense that ordinary experience had been subtly but permanently altered by what he had witnessed the previous night. As evening approached once more, Thomas found himself anticipating darkness with neither dread nor excessive hope, but rather a calm readiness to accept whatever the night might bring. The riverboat might appear again, though according to both legend and Josiah's experience, such visitations rarely occurred on consecutive nights. Or it might remain absent, its message already delivered, leaving Thomas to interpret its significance according to his own understanding. Emma appeared at dusk, bringing his evening meal in a covered basket, and her customary warmth that brightened the gathering shadows. They sat together on the dock as they had the previous evening, though Thomas noted a certain restraint in her manner, as if she sensed some change in him, but couldn't quite identify its nature. "Are you feeling well, Grandpa?" she finally asked, as they watched the first stars appear in the darkening sky. "You seem different somehow." Thomas smiled, touched by her perception and concern. "I'm fine, Emma. Just thinking about things a bit differently today. Age brings perspective, if you're lucky enough to be paying attention when it arrives." She studied his face in the fading light, her own features so reminiscent of her mother's, and through her, of Thomas's late wife, Sarah. who had passed nearly 15 years earlier. 3 generations of women with the same determined chin and expressive eyes, a legacy of strength and beauty that would continue through Emma into whatever family she created with her young engineer. "Is it about me leaving?" she asked directly, ever practical, even in emotional matters. "Because I've been thinking, maybe Andrew could find work closer to here. The mining company has operations all over the region." Thomas reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Your young man has a promising future in Arnsberg, and that's where you should go. Don't anchor yourself to an old riverboat captain whose best journeys are behind him." "But we don't want to leave you alone," Emma protested, her eyes bright with unspilled tears. "Who said anything about being alone?" Thomas countered with a smile. "I've been thinking it might be time for a change myself. Been stationary too long. It's not natural for a riverman." Emma's expression brightened. "You mean you'd come with us to Arnsberg?" Thomas considered her question carefully, not wanting to either mislead or disappoint her. "I might visit for extended periods," he said diplomatically, "but I've been corresponding with Captain Harrison of the Delta Queen. They're short a pilot familiar with the upper reaches of the Lanahechi. Seems my reputation hasn't entirely faded from memory." "You'd go back to piloting?" Emma asked, surprise evident in her voice. "At your age?" Thomas chuckled at her unintentional bluntness. "The river doesn't care how many years you've seen, only how well you read its moods and remember its secrets. And these hands," he held them up, noting with quiet satisfaction that they remained steadier than they had been in years, "still know their way around a wheelhouse." Emma's surprise gave way to thoughtful consideration. "You'd be happier on the water than in some mining town," she said after a moment, demonstrating the perceptiveness that had always distinguished her from her peers. "I can see that now." "We all have our own rivers to follow," Thomas said, the words coming to him with the feeling of discovered rather than invented wisdom. "Yours leads to Arnsberg and a future with Andrew. Mine still flows with the Lanahechi, at least for a while longer." They sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled around them, the moon, a day past full but still brilliantly round, rising above the eastern tree line to cast its silver light across the water. No mist gathered tonight, the air remaining clear and carrying the sounds of night creatures with crystalline precision. No phantom riverboat would appear under these conditions. Thomas knew instinctively. Yet he felt no disappointment at this certainty. What had been given was sufficient. To expect or demand more would be both greedy and unnecessary. After Emma had departed for home, promising to return the following evening, Thomas settled into his rocking chair with a contentment he hadn't felt in years. The decision that had been forming in his mind since his conversation with Josiah that morning now felt right and necessary. Not an escape from current circumstances, but a return to the life that had always suited him best. The phantom riverboat, whatever its objective reality, had served as catalyst for recognizing truths he had too long ignored in the name of practical consideration. 3 weeks later, Thomas Holloway stood on the pilot deck of the Delta Queen, his hands resting lightly on the great wooden wheel as the paddle steamer made its stately way upstream toward Van Horn Trading Post. At 72, he was by far the oldest pilot in the company's employ. Yet Captain Harrison had hired him without hesitation, after a brief demonstration of his still considerable skills at navigating the Lanahechi's complex channels and shifting sandbar. The night stretched calm and clear around him, stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust on velvet. Below, on the main deck, passengers enjoyed an evening concert by the boat's resident musicians, a trio of young performers whose enthusiasm more than compensated for their occasional lack of polish. Their music drifted up to the wheelhouse, providing pleasant accompaniment to Thomas's careful observation of the river ahead. A movement at the periphery of his vision caused him to turn slightly, expecting to find the first mate arriving with the evening's cup of coffee that had quickly become routine. Instead, he found himself looking at a strange distortion in the air beside the wheelhouse door, a shimmering like heat waves on a summer road, though the October night held the distinct chill of advancing autumn. As Thomas watched, the distortion gradually resolved into a more defined shape, the suggestion of a human figure, tall and slender, holding what appeared to be a violin tucked beneath one arm. Though transparent as mist, the apparition conveyed an unmistakable impression of substance. Not solid matter, perhaps, but definitely a presence rather than mere visual aberration. "Elijah Jackson," Thomas said quietly, recognizing the figure from photographs he had seen during his years on the Belle of Saint-Denis. "I wondered if we might meet properly." The spectral figure inclined its head in what could only be interpreted as acknowledgement. Though no features were clearly discernible, the entire apparition possessing the quality of an image viewed through rippled glass. Thomas sensed a smile in the subtle shift of its posture. "I took your advice," Thomas continued, feeling no fear despite the extraordinary nature of the encounter. "Got back on the river where I belong. Should have done it years ago instead of convincing myself. My piloting days were behind me." The figure raised one transparent hand in a gesture that somehow conveyed both approval and salutation between colleagues. Then it gestured toward the river ahead, where the navigation channel narrowed between submerged sandbars, a notoriously tricky passage that required a pilot's full attention, especially at night. "Right you are," Thomas agreed, returning his focus to the wheelhouse windows. "Business before conversation, even with visitors from wherever you call home these days." He made the necessary adjustments to their course, feeling the massive riverboat respond to his guidance with the same combination of power and grace he had always loved about these vessels. By the time he looked back toward the wheelhouse door, the apparition had vanished. Not suddenly, but with the gradual dissolution of mist under gentle sunlight. Yet Thomas didn't feel abandoned or unsettled by the visitation's end. Instead, a profound sense of rightness settled over him, confirmation that he had correctly interpreted the message of the phantom riverboat and its spectral musicians. Not a warning or a haunting in the traditional sense, but an invitation to reconnection with his true nature and purpose. From below came the sound of the boat's musicians transitioning into a new piece. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, a variant of Shenandoah arranged for piano, violin, and clarinet. Thomas smiled as he guided the Delta Queen through the narrow channel, her paddle wheel churning steadily against the current. Lanterns casting warm pools of light on the dark water, sliding past her hull. Ahead lay Van Horn, then St. Denis, then eventually the return journey to Bayou Noir, where Emma would be waiting to share news of wedding preparations and Andrew's latest promotion. Life, flowing forward like the river itself, always moving, always changing, yet somehow maintaining its essential nature through all transformations. And somewhere out on the night-dark water, Thomas knew without needing confirmation, the riverboat that never docked continued its eternal journey. Musicians playing for the joy of creation rather than audience, paddle wheel turning without practical purpose, passengers enjoying an endless voyage unmarred by destination or arrival. Not a tragedy, he reflected as stars wheeled overhead and the Delta Queen moved steadily upstream under his experienced guidance. Not a haunting born of violence or unfinished business, but rather a continuation of what had brought meaning in life. Music and motion and the endless fascination of the river's flow, sustained beyond conventional boundaries of existence through the perfect alchemy of love and memory. Thomas adjusted their course slightly to compensate for a cross-current, his hands sure on the wheel, his heart full with the simple contentment of being exactly where he belonged. Ahead, the river stretched dark and mysterious, yet utterly familiar. A path leading forever forward into both the unknown and the deeply remembered, much like life itself in all its beautiful complexity. As Thomas guided the Delta Queen through the darkening waters, the gentle rhythm of the paddle wheel marked the passage of time like a heartbeat. Somewhere in the distance, beyond the river's winding path and across the vast expanses of the frontier, another tale was unfolding beneath the same star-filled sky. Far from the misty riverbanks and floating melodies, the landscape transformed into rugged terrain where twin mesas stood sentinel against the horizon. There, beneath the watchful gaze of these ancient formations, flames flickered in the gathering darkness, a campfire around which another story waited to be told. The light of that distant campfire seemed to call across the miles, a beacon of warmth and wonder in the wilderness, inviting us to leave the gentle current of the Lanahichi River and journey westward, where the land rises to meet the heavens and the shadows tell stories of their own. The last whispers of daylight were fading from the western sky as Elijah Morgan guided his horse across the open plain that stretched between twin mesas. Those massive formations of red sandstone stood like ancient sentinels against the darkening horizon, their flat tops silhouetted against a canvas of deepening purple, and the first glimmering stars. Elijah had been riding since dawn, having left the small settlement of Strawberry 3 days prior, with no destination in mind beyond the next horizon. At 36, he had spent the better part of 2 decades wandering from town to town, earning his keep with nothing but his voice and the battered guitar strapped to his saddle. The life of a drifting singer suited him well enough. There was always need for entertainment in frontier towns, where hardship and monotony were constant companions to those trying to carve out an existence. Elijah brought stories in his songs, tales of love and loss, of heroism and folly, of the endless struggle between man and the unforgiving land. He sang of things that resonated in the hearts of weather-beaten ranchers and weary shopkeepers, of wide-eyed children and solemn-faced women who had buried too many dreams beneath the hard prairie soil. For an evening, his music allowed them to feel something beyond the daily grind of survival, and in return, they provided him with a meal, a drink, and occasionally a few dollars to sustain his perpetual journey. But lately, something had changed. The songs no longer flowed as easily as they once had, and Elijah found himself repeating the same tired melodies in town after town, his heart no longer finding resonance in the familiar rhythms. Something was missing, or perhaps something was present that hadn't been there before, a restlessness that couldn't be soothed by movement alone. He had left Strawberry not just in search of new audiences, but in search of something he couldn't name, some elusive answer to a question he hadn't yet properly formed. The night was fully upon him now, and Elijah realized he had misjudged both distance and direction. The twin mesas should have been behind him by now, yet there they loomed, seemingly no closer than they had been hours ago. The open plain offered few landmarks, and in the growing darkness, even the stars provided little guidance to a man whose mind had been wandering as much as his body. He was lost, though not yet dangerously so. The plains were dry but not hostile in this season, and his canteens still held enough water to see him through to morning. "Well, Dusk," he said to his dun-colored mare, patting her neck affectionately. "Seems we'll be making camp under those mesas tonight after all. A bit more riding and we'll find a suitable spot." The horse nickered softly in response, her pace steady despite the long day's journey. Elijah had purchased her 3 years prior from a rancher outside Valentine, who had claimed she was too stubborn for proper work. In Elijah's experience, she was simply particular about who earned her cooperation, a quality he respected rather than resented. They had covered thousands of miles together since, developing the wordless understanding that comes from sharing hardship and peaceful moments in equal measure. As they continued toward the mesas, Elijah noticed an unexpected pinpoint of orange light in the distance, flickering against the base of the western formation. Campfire, he realized with a mixture of relief and wariness. Company could be welcome or dangerous out here where law existed mostly as a distant concept rather than a present reality. Still, after a day of solitude, the prospect of conversation around a fire held undeniable appeal. He guided Dusk toward the light, approaching at an angle that would allow him to observe before committing to contact. As they drew nearer, he could make out a simple camp, a small fire encircled by stones. A bedroll laid out nearby, and a horse grazing a short distance away. In person then, and apparently settled in for the night rather than lying in wait for unsuspecting travelers. The setup appeared ordinary enough, yet something about the scene nagged at Elijah's senses in a way he couldn't immediately identify. Only when they had closed to within 100 yards did he realize what seemed odd. The fire cast light, but produced no smoke. Even the smallest campfire would send at least a thin tendril of smoke into the night air. Yet the flame before him burned clear and steady, as if fed by something other than wood. For a moment he considered turning away, an old superstition about phantom lights rising unbidden in his mind. But weariness and curiosity proved stronger motivators than caution, and he continued forward, calling out when he was close enough to be heard clearly, but still far enough to turn and flee if necessary. "Hello, the camp? Rider coming in, if you've no objection to company." The figure seated beside the fire looked up at his call. In the dancing light, Elijah could make out a man of indeterminate age, his face weathered by sun and wind, wearing the practical clothing of a working cowhand. Nothing remarkable or threatening about his appearance. The stranger raised a hand in greeting, but offered no verbal response to Elijah's hail. Not immediately unwelcoming then, but not effusive either. "Name's Elijah Morgan," he continued, drawing Dusk to a halt at a respectful distance. "I'm a bit turned around out here and could use a place to rest until morning. Happy to share whatever I've got by way of supplies in exchange for a spot by your fire." The stranger gestured toward the opposite side of the fire with a simple nod, apparently granting permission without words. Elijah dismounted, patting Dusk's neck before leading her to a patch of sparse grass not far from the stranger's own mount, a sturdy-looking Appaloosa with distinctive spotted hindquarters. He removed her saddle and bridle, placing them nearby before retrieving his saddlebags and bedroll. As he approached the fire, Elijah was struck again by its unusual quality. The flames danced and flickered with natural movement, casting warm light that illuminated the small circle of stones containing it, yet there was no discernible fuel source. No wood, no coal, not even dried buffalo chips that travelers sometimes used when timber was scarce. More curious still, while the fire provided illumination in abundance, it seemed to generate less heat than its size would suggest. Standing beside it, Elijah felt the gentle warmth one might experience from early morning sunlight, rather than the searing intensity of proper flames. "Unusual fire you've got here," he commented as he arranged his bedroll across from his silent host. "Never seen anything quite like it." The stranger's expression remained impassive as he made a simple gesture, a slight shrug combined with an open-palmed motion toward the surrounding landscape that seemed to suggest this peculiarity was somehow a natural feature of the location, rather than something of his creation. His continued silence was beginning to seem less like reservedness and more like a genuine inability or unwillingness to speak. "Not much for conversation, are you?" Elijah observed, receiving another shrug in response. "That's all right. A man gets used to his own company out here. No offense taken, setting aside the mystery of both the fire and his silent companion for the moment." Elijah rummaged through his saddlebags and produced a small parcel wrapped in waxed paper, his remaining provisions from Strawberry. He unwrapped it to reveal half a loaf of slightly stale bread, a hunk of cheese that had hardened on the outside but remained edible, and a few strips of dried beef. Not a feast by any measure, but adequate sustenance for a traveler accustomed to simple fare. "Care to share?" he offered, holding the parcel toward the stranger. The man shook his head slightly, then reached beside him to lift a battered tin cup and raised it in Elijah's direction. Not quite a toast, but a gesture indicating he had his own provisions and needed nothing. Elijah nodded acknowledgement and set about making a simple meal for himself, tearing off a piece of bread and cutting a portion of cheese to go with it. As he ate, Elijah studied his companion more carefully. The man's clothing was worn but well maintained, suggesting someone who took care with limited resources. His hands bore the calluses of hard physical labor, most likely ranch work given his general appearance. There was a quietude about him that went beyond mere silence, a stillness that seemed almost contemplative, as if he were listening to something beyond ordinary hearing. Most notable, though, was the lack of any weapons within reach. Out here, nearly everyone traveled armed in some fashion, yet this man sat beside his mysterious fire, with apparently no means of defense beyond his own physical capabilities. "You know," Elijah said after finishing his simple meal, "in my experience, folks who don't talk much usually have the most interesting stories." He smiled slightly, not expecting a response, but feeling compelled to fill the silence nonetheless. "To me, I tell other people's stories for a living. I'm a singer, go from town to town sharing songs about all manner of things. Used to be I could spin a new tune from whatever I saw along the trail, but lately..." He trailed off, suddenly aware that he was sharing more than was customary with a complete stranger, especially one who hadn't asked. The silent man regarded him with quiet interest, offering neither encouragement nor discouragement for him to continue. His eyes reflected the dancing flames, giving them an unusual depth that Elijah found slightly unsettling, yet not threatening. There was something about this man and this place that invited candor, as if the normal barriers between strangers had been temporarily suspended by mutual agreement. "Lately I've been wondering what it's all for," Elijah found himself continuing, despite having had no intention of discussing such matters. 20 years of wandering, singing other people's joys and sorrows, and what do I have to show for it? No home, no family, not even many possessions beyond what dusk can carry. Sometimes I think I should have stayed in one place, put down roots, built something lasting. He gave a rueful chuckle. But then, I likely would have spent those years wondering what I was missing out on the trail. Seems a man's always longing for what he doesn't have. The stranger nodded slowly, his expression suggesting not just understanding, but a deep personal familiarity with the sentiment Elijah had expressed. He gestured toward the fire, then to himself, and finally made a circular motion with his finger before pointing back to the fire, a series of movements that Elijah interpreted to mean this was not the man's first visit to this particular spot. "You come here regular then?" Elijah asked, receiving another nod in confirmation. "Something special about this place?" The silent man made no immediate response beyond a thoughtful expression. Then, with deliberate movements, he reached for a small leather pouch tucked inside his jacket. Opening it carefully, he withdrew what appeared to be a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and soft from repeated handling. With reverent care, he unfolded it to reveal what Elijah could now see was a small pencil drawing, simple but skillfully executed, of a woman holding an infant, both rendered with evident affection. The man gazed at the image for a long moment before turning it toward Elijah, allowing him to see what was clearly a treasured possession. "Family?" Elijah asked softly. The man nodded, his expression revealing more in that simple movement than many men might express in a torrent of words. There was love there, certainly, but also profound loss. The look of someone who carried the weight of absence every day of his life. He folded the drawing with the same care he had shown in removing it, returned it to its pouch and tucked it away. Then he gestured toward the mysterious fire again, tapped his chest, and finally pointed to his temple. "The fire shows you something about them," Elijah guessed, trying to interpret the pantomime. "Or helps you remember." The man tilted his head slightly, considering this interpretation before offering a nuanced response. Not quite disagreement, but suggesting Elijah hadn't fully grasped his meaning. He repeated the gesture toward the fire, but this time followed it by placing both hands over his heart, then moving them outward as if releasing something into the air. "It brings what's inside out," Elijah said slowly, comprehension dawning. "What you carry in your heart becomes visible somehow?" This earned a more definitive nod of confirmation, along with a slight gesture toward Elijah that seemed to invite him to experience the phenomenon for himself. The suggestion brought a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. Whatever this fire was, some natural oddity or something more difficult to explain, it clearly held significance beyond mere illumination or warmth. "I appreciate the invitation," Elijah said carefully, "but I think I'll just enjoy the light for now, if that's all the same to you." The silent man accepted this decision without apparent judgment, settling back into his previous position of quiet contemplation. For a time they sat in companionable silence, the strange fire casting its steady glow across the small camp as the night deepened around them. Overhead, stars crowded the vast dome of the sky, their ancient light a reminder of how small human concerns were in the grand scheme of creation. Eventually, Elijah reached for his guitar, removing it from its protective wrappings with practiced hands. "Do you mind?" he asked, receiving a gesturing invitation to proceed. "Sometimes I think better with strings under my fingers." He began to play, not singing at first, just letting simple melodies emerge as his fingers found their familiar patterns across the fretboard. The notes drifted into the night air, mingling with the occasional distant call of a coyote and the soft rustling of desert winds through the scrubby vegetation that dotted the plain. There was comfort in the ritual of music, in the way it ordered thoughts and emotions into something comprehensible, if not always controllable. As he played, Elijah found his attention repeatedly drawn to the peculiar fire. Its flames seemed almost responsive to his music, dancing with more vigor when the tempo increased, and settling into gentle undulation during slower passages. More than once, he thought he glimpsed shapes within the fire itself. Not distinct images, but suggestions of form and movement that hovered just beyond clear perception, like memories not quite fully recalled. "You know," he said after completing a particularly melancholy tune, "when I was a boy, my grandfather used to tell stories about special places where the veil between worlds grew thin. Said there were spots out on the frontier where a person might glimpse things not ordinarily seen, if they came with an open heart and the right timing." He strummed a soft chord. "Never put much stock in those tales myself, but I've seen enough strange things in my travels to keep from dismissing them outright." The silent man nodded, his expression suggesting neither surprise nor skepticism at Elijah's reference to the supernatural. He gestured toward the fire again, then swept his arm to encompass the twin mazes looming dark against the star-filled sky. "This is one of those places, you think?" Elijah asked, receiving another nod in response. "And that's why you come back? To connect with what you've lost?" Something in the man's expression shifted slightly at these words. Not disagreement exactly, but a gentle correction. He placed his hand over his heart again, then pointed to his head before gesturing toward the horizon, where, in a few hours, dawn would begin to break. "Not just to remember then," Elijah interpreted thoughtfully, "but to find something. Clarity, maybe? A way forward?" This earned a more definitive nod of confirmation, along with what might have been the ghost of a smile. The first such expression Elijah had seen from his taciturn companion. There was something deeply personal yet universal in the silent exchange. A recognition that beneath the specifics of individual circumstance lay common human experiences of loss, questioning, and the search for meaning. Before Elijah could respond further, a movement at the periphery of their small circle of firelight caught his attention. Looking up, he was startled to see a horse standing perhaps 30 yards away. Not his dusk nor his companion's Appaloosa, but a magnificent wild stallion, its coat a deep chestnut that appeared almost blood red in the strange illumination of the fireless flames. The animal stood perfectly still, watching them with an intensity that seemed far too deliberate for an ordinary beast. "Well, I'll be," Elijah murmured, keeping his voice low to avoid startling the creature. "That's a fine-looking horse. Been following you long?" The silent man glanced toward the stallion with evident familiarity but no surprise, suggesting this was not their first encounter. He shook his head slightly in response to Elijah's question, then gestured toward the fire and back to the wild horse, indicating some connection between the two. "Only comes when the fire is lit," Elijah guessed, receiving a confirming nod. "Another mystery of twin messes, I suppose." The stallion maintained its vigilant stance, neither approaching nor retreating, its presence adding yet another layer to the growing sense that this was indeed a place where ordinary rules might temporarily bend. Elijah found himself wondering what other wonders or oddities might reveal themselves as the night progressed, and whether he had stumbled upon something genuinely supernatural or merely a series of coincidences given significance by human tendency to seek patterns and meaning. As if sensing his internal debate, the silent man reached forward toward the unusual fire, passing his hand directly through the flames without apparent harm or discomfort. He held his palm within the dancing light for several seconds before withdrawing it, then turned it toward Elijah to demonstrate there was no burn or mark of any kind. Having made this point, he gestured toward Elijah with an invitation to try the same experiment himself. Curiosity overcame caution, and Elijah cautiously extended his own hand toward the fire, hesitating just at the boundary where warmth became more pronounced. Taking a breath for courage, he pushed his fingers forward into what should have been searing heat. Instead, he felt only a pleasant tingling sensation, as if his hand had passed through nothing more dangerous than early morning mist illuminated by sunrise. Drawing back in astonishment, he examined his hand to confirm what his senses reported. No burn, no pain, not even the temporary reddening that would accompany brief exposure to ordinary flame. "What is this place?" he whispered, the question directed as much to himself as to his silent companion. "What is this fire?" In response, the man merely gestured toward the surrounding landscape, the mesas, the star-filled sky, and finally toward Elijah himself. a comprehensive movement that seemed to suggest the answer lay not in some external explanation, but in the totality of existence, including Elijah's own perceptions and interpretations. One of those mysteries better experienced than explained. Is that it? Elijah said with a slight smile, receiving a nod that might have conveyed both confirmation and approval of his willingness to accept the inexplicable on its own terms. The night deepened as they sat in companionable silence, broken occasionally by soft melodies from Elijah's guitar or the distant call of nocturnal creatures going about their business in the vast darkness beyond their small circle of illumination. The wild stallion remained at its watchful post, occasionally shifting position but never approaching closer nor retreating from view. As midnight came and went, marked by the slow wheel of stars across the heavens, Elijah found himself growing drowsy despite the strangeness of his circumstances. Setting aside his guitar, he arranged his bedroll more comfortably and stretched out beside the peculiar fire, its gentle warmth now a welcome companion against the deepening chill of the desert night. "If you've no objection," he said through a yawn, "I think I'll get some rest. Been a long day of riding, and it seems dusk and I will need our strength to find our way come morning." The silent man acknowledged this with a simple nod, making no move toward his own bedroll, but settling into what appeared to be a posture of patient watchfulness. There was something reassuring about his vigilance, a sense that he stood guard not just over their small camp, but over the border between ordinary experience and whatever lay beyond it in this unusual place. As Elijah drifted toward sleep, lulled by the hypnotic dance of the flameless fire, he found his thoughts turning unexpectedly toward paths not taken and choices left behind, the faces of people he had known briefly and departed from hastily, opportunities for connection abandoned in favor of maintaining his freedom to wander, the family he might have created had he ever stayed in one place long enough to put down roots. These reflections came not with their usual accompanying edge of restless dissatisfaction, but with a gentler quality, a contemplative recognition rather than regretful rumination. His last conscious awareness before sleep claimed him completely was of the silent man sitting motionless across the fire, the wild stallion standing sentinel in the darkness beyond, and the massive silhouettes of twin messes rising against the star-scattered sky, all forming a tableau that seemed both perfectly natural and utterly extraordinary in the same moment. When dreams came, they arrived with unusual clarity and coherence. Elijah found himself walking across the same plain where he had made camp, but in his dream the landscape was illuminated by neither sun nor moon, but by a diffuse light that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The twin mesas stood as they did in waking reality, yet somehow they appeared not as geological formations, but as intentional creations, monuments erected by some ancient, forgotten civilization for purposes beyond modern comprehension. As he walked, Elijah became aware that he was following a path invisible in his waking hours, yet clearly marked in this dreamscape, a trail used by countless others before him, its course determined by some logic deeper than convenience or practicality. The path led him not around but directly between the two mesas, into a narrow passage that opened into a protected valley hidden from outside view. Within this secret valley stood a small settlement, not a proper town, but a gathering of simple dwellings arranged around a central space where, curiously, burned a fire identical to the one beside which his physical body now slept. People moved about the settlement, engaged in ordinary activities of daily life, yet there was nothing ordinary about them. Despite wearing clothes typical of various periods and cultures spanning centuries, they interacted as a unified community, bound by something beyond shared territory or blood kinship. As Elijah approached, These dream people turned to acknowledge him, not with the wariness typically afforded strangers, but with the warm recognition extended to someone long expected. An elderly woman with features that suggested indigenous heritage stepped forward, her eyes alight with wisdom accumulated across what seemed multiple lifetimes. "The singer arrives," she stated simply, her voice carrying despite its softness. "Come, sit by our fire. It has been waiting for you." "I don't understand," Elijah replied, finding he could speak in this dream with a clarity often absent in ordinary sleep visions. "What is this place? Who are all of you?" The woman smiled, the expression transforming her lined face into a map of experienced joy and sorrow. "We are the ones who found the fire when we needed its light. Some stayed, others continued their journeys. All were changed by what they saw within the flame." She led him to the central fire, that strange woodless blaze that generated light without smoke and warmth without excessive heat. The gathered community made space for him in their circle, offering neither judgment nor expectation, merely patient presence as he took a seat directly across from the elderly woman. "What am I supposed to see?" he asked, studying the dancing flames for some revelation or sign. "Depends," she replied gently. "Depends entirely on what you need to find. The fire shows nothing that isn't already within you, waiting to be recognized." As if responding to her words, the flames before him began to shift, their random patterns gradually resolving into more structured movement. Within their dance, Elijah began to discern faces, dozens of them, flashing briefly before dissolving back into abstract light. He recognized many, people he had sung for in countless saloons and gathering places across the territories. Fellow travelers encountered briefly on shared sections of trail, women and men with whom he had shared moments of connection before the horizon called him onward. "These are all the lives you've touched," the elderly woman observed, her voice somehow audible beneath the soft crackling of the fire. "More numerous than you realized, yes." Before Elijah could respond, the flames shifted again, now showing not just faces but moments. Brief scenes of his music bringing comfort to the grieving, courage to the frightened, joy to celebrations, and solace to the lonely. He saw how his songs had become part of the invisible threads connecting human experiences across the vastness of the frontier, linking isolated communities through shared stories carried from place to place by his wandering presence. "I never thought of it that way," he admitted, watching as the fire continued its display of moments he had considered insignificant at the time. A song requested repeatedly in a mining camp that had just suffered a deadly collapse. A lullaby taught to a young mother struggling with her firstborn in a remote homestead. An old ballad that had brought tears to the eyes of a grizzled trapper who claimed to have forgotten the sound of his homeland until Elijah's music reminded him. "We rarely see the true shape of our own lives," the woman replied. "The patterns only become visible when viewed from sufficient distance." The flames shifted once more, now showing alternate versions of Elijah himself, the settled family man he sometimes imagined becoming, the successful performer in eastern cities he occasionally dreamed of being, the respected teacher passing his musical knowledge to eager students, the solitary hermit retreating from human connection entirely. Each version appeared briefly before dissolving back into the fire, none lingering long enough to suggest greater validity than the others. "Are these paths I could have taken?" he asked, watching these might-have-been selves with fascination and mild discomfort. "Choices I should have made differently?" "They are possibilities that existed and still exist," the woman answered. "But notice how the fire shows them, not as failures to be regretted, but as parallels to be acknowledged. There is no single right path for a life, Singer. There is only the path you walk and what you make of it as you go. As she spoke, the flames coalesced into a new image, a map of sorts, showing trails connecting distant settlements across vast territories. Elijah recognized it as a representation of his own wandering route over 20 years, a seemingly random meandering across the landscape. Yet viewed in its entirety from this dream perspective, the pattern revealed an underlying coherence he had never perceived, as if his supposedly aimless wandering had been guided by some deeper purpose all along. "What does it mean?" he asked, unable to interpret this final vision with certainty. "These," the elderly woman replied, with a smile that conveyed both wisdom and gentle mischief, "is for you to determine, Singer. The fire shows, it does not explain. The meaning comes from the viewer, not the vision." Before Elijah could press for more concrete guidance, the dreamscape began to shift around him. The settlement, with its mysterious inhabitants, started to fade like morning mist under strengthening sunlight. The elderly woman remained visible longest, her expression compassionate as she offered one final observation. "Remember, the fire burns always, whether you can see it or not. Its light remains available to those who seek it with honest hearts. You have found it once. You can find it again when needed." With these words, the dream dissolved completely, leaving Elijah in the formless darkness of deep sleep. Yet unlike ordinary transitions between dreaming and waking, he carried a lingering awareness of the vision's clarity and significance, as consciousness gradually returned with the first hints of dawn breaking over the eastern horizon. Opening his eyes, Elijah found himself exactly where he had fallen asleep, beside the mysterious fire near Twin Mesas. The flames continued their steady dance, apparently undiminished by the passing of hours, though they seemed somehow less dramatic against the growing light of early morning. Across from him, the silent man remained in his position of watchful repose, showing no signs of having slept during the night. The wild stallion was gone from its observational post, having departed unseen and unheard, while Elijah dreamed. "Morning," Elijah murmured, sitting up and rubbing sleep from his eyes. Or nearly so, at least. The silent man acknowledged this with a slight nod, his expression revealing neither fatigue nor discomfort despite his apparent night-long vigil. There was something different about him in the strengthening dawn light. Not a physical change exactly, but a sense of imminent departure, as if he had completed whatever purpose had brought him to this place and now prepared to continue onward. "I had unusual dreams," Elijah said after a moment, uncertain how much to share, yet feeling compelled to acknowledge the experience. More vivid than ordinary, more meaningful somehow. This observation earned a knowing nod from his companion, who gestured toward the fire and then tapped his own temple, confirmation that such dreams were an expected outcome of sleeping beside this particular flame. The silent man then pointed toward the eastern horizon, where the first direct rays of sunlight would soon appear, followed by a gesture toward the mysterious fire between them. "The fire goes out at dawn," Elijah guessed, receiving another nod in response. "Does it return each night, or only special times?" The silent man extended one finger, then swept his arm across the sky in an arc that Elijah interpreted as representing the passage of a full year, suggesting the phenomenon was annual rather than nightly. He followed this with a gesture indicating the same circular pattern of return that he had demonstrated the previous evening, coming back to this specific location repeatedly over time. "You come here every year then," Elijah concluded, receiving confirmation in the form of a deliberate nod. "For the dreams?" For clarity, his companion's response was more nuanced, a slight tilt of the head, combined with an open-handed gesture that suggested Elijah's interpretation was partially correct, but incomplete. The silent man then placed his hand over his heart, closed his eyes briefly, and reopened them with an expression of profound peace, communicating without words that his annual pilgrimage served some deeply personal purpose related to internal reconciliation rather than external revelation. Before Elijah could inquire further, a noticeable change occurred in the quality of light around them. The first direct ray of sunlight had crested the eastern horizon, sending a golden beam across the plain toward their small camp. As this natural illumination touched the mysterious fire, something extraordinary happened. The flames neither vanished suddenly nor gradually diminished, but rather seemed to sink into the earth itself, as if being absorbed by the very ground from which they had apparently emerged. Within moments, nothing remained but the circle of stones surrounding ordinary dirt that showed no sign of having hosted a burning fire throughout the night. The silent man watched this transition with evident familiarity, showing neither surprise nor disappointment at the fire's disappearance. With the methodical movements of someone following long-established routine, he began gathering his meager possessions, clearly preparing to depart now that the phenomenon had completed its cycle. "You're leaving already?" Elijah asked, receiving a simple nod in response. "Will you return next year?" This question prompted a more complex answer, a gesture toward the horizon, followed by a circular motion similar to his previous indication of annual return, but this time accompanied by a slight shrug and open-handed gesture, suggesting uncertainty rather than definitive planning. "Not yes, but perhaps, if circumstances allow." "Well," Elijah said, extending his hand in the universal gesture of parting, "I appreciate the hospitality, such as it was, and the experience. Not sure I understand it fully, but I'm grateful nonetheless." The silent man accepted the handshake with a firm grip that conveyed genuine human connection despite their lack of verbal communication. There was something in his eyes, a recognition perhaps, of shared understanding that transcended the need for spoken language. With a final nod that somehow managed to convey both farewell and acknowledgement of something meaningful exchanged, he turned toward his Appaloosa, now fully saddled and ready for departure. Elijah watched as the man mounted with practiced ease and guided his horse toward the west, not toward any visible trail, but directly into the open country beyond Twin Mesa. Within minutes, horse and rider had dwindled to a small moving dot against the vast landscape before disappearing entirely from view, leaving Elijah alone in the growing light of morning with only the memory of strange flames and vivid dreams as evidence of their encounter. For a time he remained seated beside the now ordinary circle of stones, contemplating both the inexplicable events of the night and the surprisingly coherent message of his dream vision. The elderly woman's words echoed in his mind. "There is no single right path for a life, singer. There is only the path you walk and what you make of it as you go." Perhaps that was the true revelation. Not that he should abandon his wandering life for some more conventional existence, but that he should recognize the value and meaning in the journey he had already chosen. His music, carried from settlement to settlement across the vast territories, formed connections invisible to casual observation, yet vital to the human tapestry being woven across the frontier. If the pattern only became apparent when viewed from sufficient distance, as the dream woman had suggested, then perhaps his occasional feelings of aimlessness stemmed not from lacking purpose, but from standing too close to see the design he was helping to create. With this perspective settling into place, Elijah finally rose and began preparing for his own departure. As he gathered his belongings and saddled Dusk, who had weathered the night without apparent concern for the unusual nature of their campsite, he found himself humming a new melody, something that hadn't happened in many months. The tune seemed to emerge fully formed from some interior wellspring that had been temporarily blocked but now flowed freely again. Words began attaching themselves to the melody as he worked, a song taking shape about unexpected encounters in liminal spaces, about fires that illuminated without burning, and about the invisible patterns connecting seemingly random events into meaningful wholes. It wasn't a sad song, or even particularly melancholy, despite touching on themes of transience and uncertainty. Rather, it carried a quality of gentle affirmation, acknowledgement that mystery and meaning could coexist without requiring one to diminish the other. With dusk saddled and his gear secured, Elijah took a final moment to survey the site of his unusual experience. The circle of stones looked entirely ordinary in the morning light, giving no indication of having hosted an inexplicable phenomenon throughout the night. The twin mesas stood as they had for countless millennia, their red sandstone faces beginning to glow with the strengthening sunlight. Nothing remained to prove the strangeness of what had occurred, nothing except the new song forming in his mind and the subtle shift in perspective it represented. "Well, Dusk," he said, patting the mare's neck affectionately as he mounted. "Seems we've got a new tune to share when we reach the next town. And maybe a story too, though I suspect that part might be better kept between ourselves." Guiding his horse eastward, having decided during his reflections that the settlement of Valentine would be his next destination, Elijah began singing his new composition aloud, giving it structure and substance with each repetition. The sound carried across the open plain, a solitary human voice against the vast silence of the landscape, marking his passage as surely as footprints in soft earth. As he rode, a movement caught his attention at the periphery of his vision. Turning slightly in the saddle, he glimpsed the wild stallion standing atop a low rise some distance away. That magnificent chestnut coat, now illuminated by direct sunlight rather than mysterious flame, yet no less impressive for the change in lighting. The animal watched his departure with the same deliberate attention it had shown during the night, its stance suggesting not mere animal curiosity, but something more intentional, awareness, perhaps, of shared participation in events beyond ordinary understanding. Elijah raised his hand in acknowledgement of this final observer, receiving in response a dignified toss of the stallion's head before it turned and galloped away across the plain, its movements embodying a freedom both wild and purposeful. The sight brought a smile to Elijah's face and added another verse to his developing song, something about kindred spirits recognizing each other across differences of form and circumstance. As twin mesas receded behind him and the morning sun climbed higher in the eastern sky, Elijah continued his journey with a lightness he hadn't felt in months, or perhaps years. The road ahead remained as uncertain as ever, the future as unpredictable, yet these facts no longer generated the restless dissatisfaction that had driven him from Strawberry without clear destination. Whatever might await him in Valentine or beyond, he carried with him now not just new music, but renewed appreciation for his chosen path. The wandering route that, viewed from proper perspective, revealed its own particular coherence and meaning. Whether the fire between twin mesas had been some natural phenomenon with unusual properties, a genuine manifestation of something beyond ordinary reality, or simply the catalyst for his own internal reckoning, mattered less than the clarity it had helped him achieve. The elderly woman in his dream had been right. The fire showed nothing that wasn't already within him, waiting to be recognized. Its light had simply illuminated connections and patterns previously obscured by proximity and habit, allowing him to see with fresh eyes what had been present all along. As the day brightened around him and familiar rhythms of travel reasserted themselves, Elijah continued developing his new song, each verse building on the ones before to create something that felt both personally meaningful and potentially significant to others who might hear it in the days ahead. The horizon beckoned as it always had, but now with invitation rather than compulsion, offering not escape from what lay behind, but connection to what waited beyond. Behind him, twin mezzas stood sentinel over their hidden mystery, the extinguished fire waiting beneath ordinary earth for its next appointed manifestation. Whether Elijah would return when that time came remained uncertain, one possibility among many in a life characterized by constant movement. Yet something told him their paths might cross again under similar circumstances, drawn together by shared participation in the delicate balance between individual journey and collective pattern, between mundane reality and the mysteries that occasionally revealed themselves to those prepared to recognize them. Until then, he had a new song to perfect, and countless audiences waiting in settlements scattered across the vast frontier. People whose lives would briefly intersect with his own before diverging again, creating moments of connection that, while temporary, contributed to something more enduring than any single relationship or location could provide. It was, he realized as Valentine's distant church spire appeared on the eastern horizon, a worthy purpose for a wandering singer who carried not just music, but the invisible threads that help bind frontier communities into something greater than the sum of their isolated parts. With this thought warming him more effectively than any campfire could manage, Elijah guided dusk toward the waiting settlement, already anticipating the new faces that would soon gather to hear his songs, including the one born beside a mysterious flame between twin mesas, where dreams revealed truths already known but temporarily forgotten, and where the path ahead clarified not through dramatic revelation but through gentle reminder of what mattered most along the journey. And so, partner, as our tale rides off into the sunset, it's time for you to rest your weary bones beneath the endless prairie sky. Let the sounds of the west be your lullaby tonight, from the gentle crackle of the campfire to the soft prairie winds and the distant song of nightbirds, all flowing uninterrupted, with no advertisements to break the peace of your slumber. Sweet dreams, cowpoke, and may your trail lead to peaceful pastures tonight.